After decades of silence, Chuck Norris breaks his stoic demeanor to name the actors he despises most. For most of his career, Chuck Norris built a reputation not just on power, but on principle. He was the man who let his fists do the talking, who never lowered himself into petty Hollywood brawls. In an industry overflowing with egos, scandals, and attention seekers, Chuck remained the calm in the storm, respected, feared, and above all, silent. But silence is never eternal. And when a man like Chuck Norris finally speaks, the world listens. That's exactly what happened when, out of nowhere, he broke his decades-long vow of neutrality and publicly called out 4 actors he simply could no longer stand. It wasn't just a list, it was a reckoning for a man known to roundhouse kick villains without saying a word. This moment felt like an earthquake. Fans were stunned. Reporters scrambled. Social media exploded. Why now? Why them? And what had driven the martial arts legend to step into the ring, not with fists, but with words? It wasn't just about dislike. Chuck Norris didn't name names to stir drama. No, this was deeper. These were names tied to values he believed had been abandoned. Behaviors that crossed a line. Moments he could no longer ignore. Some were professional wounds. Others, moral ones. But each one meant something to Chuck. For a man who once trained with Bruce Lee, who mentored young fighters and led with discipline, these betrayals cut deep. This wasn't just about who irritated him, it was about who betrayed the very code he lived by, and when he spoke, the media ran with it like wildfire. Headlines declared the unthinkable. Chuck Norris hates them. Tabloids speculated. Fans picked sides. But as wild as it seemed, those closest to him weren't surprised. They knew the storm had been brewing for years. The signs had been there in cryptic interviews, in subtle jabs, in quiet disappointments he once tried to keep private. But the mask had finally come off. And beneath it was a man tired of pretending that respect alone could fix what had broken. This moment wasn't just a reveal, it was a turning point. It opened the gates to a darker, more honest version of Chuck Norris. One who no longer bit his tongue, one who was ready to tell the truth, no matter the backlash. And that's exactly what we're about to uncover. Because the names he mentioned aren't just familiar, they're icons. And their stories with Chuck are filled with betrayal, pride, politics, and pain. To understand the weight of his words, we must first explore the journey that shaped Chuck Norris. A troubled childhood and military service forged the foundation of a future icon. Long before Chuck Norris became a household name or a symbol of unshakable strength, he was just a boy. In Ryan, Oklahoma, timid, overlooked, and burdened by circumstances no child should face. His father, a World War II veteran turned alcoholic drifter, was often absent, leaving Chuck's mother, Wilma, to hold the family together with little more than grit and prayer. In school, Chuck was painfully shy, academically average, and physically unremarkable. There was nothing about him that screamed legend. He wasn't the class hero or the athletic prodigy. He was just trying to survive quietly, cautiously, and often in the shadows. But pain has a way of shaping destiny, and Chuck's early battles with insecurity and abandonment planted the seeds of a fierce determination that the world wouldn't see coming. When his parents divorced, Chuck was just 16. The trauma fractured the last bit of normalcy in his life. He moved with his mother and brothers to Kansas and then to California, where the world felt even more alien. He didn't fit in. He didn't speak up. He simply endured. But fate had already begun preparing him for a brutal transformation. At 18, in desperate need of direction, Chuck joined the U.S. Air Force. It was in the military, not Hollywood, where the first embers of legend were lit. Stationed in South Korea, he encountered something that would forever alter his path. Tang Soo Do. What started as a casual interest quickly turned into obsession. Martial arts gave him structure. It gave him control. And for the first time in his life, it gave him confidence. He wasn't just learning how to fight. He was learning how to live. By the time Chuck returned to California, he had earned his black belt and a new sense of identity. He wasn't the same lost boy anymore. He was Chuck, disciplined, focused, and relentless. While waiting for a job with the police department, he opened his first martial arts studio. It was modest. It was uncertain. But it was his. And when he stepped into his first competitive match, he didn't win. In fact, he lost repeatedly. But those losses didn't crush him, they forged him. With every defeat, he sharpened his skills. With every disappointment, he fueled his hunger. And by 1967, he wasn't just competing, he was dominating. He began winning major tournaments, defeating legends like Joe Louis, and earning the attention of Hollywood's elite. Stars like Steve McQueen and Donny Osmond sought him out as a teacher, drawn to his mastery and poise. Then came the turning point. Bruce Lee. A shared passion for martial arts turned into a deep friendship. And in 1972, Chuck appeared opposite, Lee in Way of the Dragon. It wasn't just a fight scene, it was a declaration. Chuck Norris had arrived. A few years later, he transitioned into lead roles, headlining films like Breaker, and Good Guys Wear Black. These weren't high-budget blockbusters, but they struck a chord. Unlike the kung fu films from Hong Kong, Chuck's stories were American, relatable, and raw. Audiences connected with the idea of a quiet warrior defending justice on his own terms. And just like that, he went from martial arts champion to America's first true martial arts movie star. As his star rose, so did the complexities of his personal and professional life. Beyond the spotlight, Norris's personal choices reveal a man of conviction and controversy. For all the discipline and fury Chuck Norris brought to the screen, his personal life was shaped not by fame or force, but by love, failure, redemption, and faith. Long before the world saw him as an indestructible warrior, Chuck was just an 18-year-old kid marrying his high school sweetheart, Diane Holchek. They were young, in love, and barely out of school, clinging to each other for stability as his military career began. In 1962, they welcomed their first child, a son. But what followed wasn't the fairy tale people assumed. A year later, from a brief affair outside of marriage, Chuck fathered a daughter, something he kept hidden for decades. It would take over 26 years, a handwritten letter, and a lifetime of guilt before he would finally meet her. By then, his marriage to Diane had crumbled, and their 30-year union quietly came to an end during the filming of Delta Force 2. Chuck had spent so long being the rock for others, but his own foundation had quietly cracked beneath the weight of time and secrecy. Yet even amid heartbreak, Chuck sought restoration. In 1998, he married Gina O'Kelly, a former model 23 years his junior. Together, they built a new life, one grounded in family, values, and faith. Gina brought 2 children from her previous marriage, and Chuck embraced them as his own. The couple later welcomed twins, and for a while, life seemed to settle into something peaceful. But Norris had never been a man content with silence, and his convictions, once private, began making their way into the public sphere. The foundation of his beliefs was clear. Chuck Norris was a devout Christian. And with that faith came bold opinions that didn't always sit well with modern Hollywood. He didn't care. In his eyes, standing for truth was more important than staying popular. Chuck began writing columns, speaking at conservative events, and publicly endorsing Republican candidates. He aligned himself with the values of discipline, faith, and traditional family structures. When others in Hollywood mocked those principles, he fired back not with jokes, but with warnings. He wasn't just an actor anymore. He had become a symbol for a side of America that felt pushed aside. But with that stance came controversy. His vocal opposition to same-sex marriage, his support of Proposition 8, and his criticism of progressive leaders ignited backlash. Fans who once adored his movies now found themselves divided, torn between admiration for the legend and discomfort with his views. Norris didn't flinch. In his mind, morality wasn't up for debate, but these beliefs weren't born in a vacuum. They were shaped by every hardship he'd endured, every betrayal he'd forgiven, and every battle he'd fought, both in the ring and in life. His faith had saved him when the world nearly broke him. It gave him clarity. It gave him direction. And eventually, it would lead to clashes far more personal than any movie fight scene ever could. These deeply held beliefs would later clash with the ideologies of fellow actors. An internet phenomenon turns Norris into a legendary figure beyond his control. It began as a joke, a whisper on internet forums, a few exaggerated punchlines about a man who could roundhouse kick time itself. But what started as playful banter quickly spiraled into a cultural storm. By 2005, Chuck Norris' facts had taken over the digital world. Suddenly, Norris wasn't just a martial arts icon, he was a myth. The internet crowned him a near superhuman force, credited with splitting atoms with his stare and defeating armies in his sleep. The world laughed, reposted, and remixed the jokes until they became more famous than some of his films. But underneath, the absurd humor was something bigger. Chuck Norris had been reborn, not through Hollywood, but through code and keyboards, and he hadn't even asked for it. At first, Norris took it in stride. He chuckled, even thanked fans for the attention, recognizing the humor in the absurdity. But as the jokes got wilder, and the myth grew larger than the man himself, cracks began to form. His name was being used to sell books, power websites, and rake in profits, none of which he controlled. In 2007, he drew the line and filed a lawsuit against Penguin USA for a book that had compiled the facts without his consent. This wasn't about pride, it was about principle. Chuck Norris had spent decades building a reputation of honor and discipline, and now his identity had been hijacked by satire. The lawsuit made headlines, but in the end, he dropped the case. Maybe because he knew the legend had become too big to fight. Or maybe because he realized something more unsettling. He could never fully reclaim his image. The internet had immortalized him in a way no film ever could. Chuck Norris was no longer just a man, he was a meme, a symbol, a digital god. His name appeared in commercials, video games, and late-night jokes. In The Expendables 2, even Sylvester Stallone embraced the myth with a Cobra joke straight from the fan-made archives. Companies lined up to borrow his persona for their ads. United Healthcare ran a commercial in 2017 that had two men debating who Chuck Norris would save first. It was surreal. The world loved this unstoppable, invincible caricature. But that wasn't the Chuck Norris who lived quietly with his family, who prayed every morning, who believed in accountability and order. Balancing these two worlds, legend and man, became a struggle. How do you correct the world when it's too busy laughing? How do you preach humility when you're treated like a god? Chuck never shunned the fans. He appreciated their love. But he also knew there was a danger in distortion. His values were rooted in truth, not myth. And for a man who built his life on discipline and authenticity, watching his name float untethered through cyberspace was both flattering and unsettling. While the internet celebrated him, real-life conflicts brewed beneath the surface. A friendship, born in martial arts, turns sour amidst professional rivalry. In the world of martial arts, respect isn't given, it's earned. And in the early days of Jean-Claude Van Damme's Hollywood journey, he understood that. He wasn't yet the muscles from Brussels. He was a young immigrant with a thick accent, big dreams, and a desperate hunger to be noticed. So he did what many aspiring stars do, took odd jobs, small roles, and whatever work kept him close to the action. One of those jobs landed him at Woody's Wharf, a bar owned by none other than Chuck Norris. Back then, Van Damme worked as a bouncer, relying on charm more than fists, keeping the peace under the roof of a man he admired. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave him proximity to the legend. And in that humble beginning, a bond was formed, two martial artists at very different stages of their journey, tied together by discipline, ambition, and a shared love for the craft. Their camaraderie extended beyond the bar. In martial arts circles, both men respected each other's skills. Chuck had already become a household name, while Van Damme was still climbing. But Norris didn't gatekeep. He opened doors, shared wisdom, and even entertained the idea of collaborating on a project. There were whispers of a potential film, two titans on screen, side by side. Fans were ecstatic at the thought. But behind the scenes, things were beginning to shift. Van Damme was gaining traction, fast. His star was rising, his ego inflating, and the discipline that once bound them began to fray. Reports emerged of creative clashes. Chuck, a stickler for form, control, and humility, saw something reckless in Van Damme, a showman more focused on flair than substance. And that difference would become the wedge that split them. The movie never happened. The collaboration, once so promising, dissolved quietly. Chuck never spoke publicly about the fallout, not in specifics. But when asked about Van Damme years later during a martial arts expo, he didn't hold back. He questioned his discipline, his work ethic, and his approach to the art they both once revered. The words were sharp, but controlled. There was no name-calling, just disappointment. It wasn't just about a missed opportunity, it was about a broken code. For Norris, martial arts wasn't a gimmick or a platform. It was a philosophy. And when that philosophy was diluted, it wasn't just personal, it was offensive. Van Damme, for his part, took a softer tone. In interviews, he laughed about those early days, reminiscing about working for Chuck with no hint of hostility. He claimed admiration, even gratitude. But the warmth felt one-sided. To Chuck, the silence spoke louder than praise. No collaboration ever surfaced. No joint project ever followed. What remained was a quiet void. A friendship turned cold. A respect, once shared but ultimately lost. Another martial artist would challenge Norris's values even more directly. Disrespect towards mentors and peers ignites a feud with lasting repercussions. In the disciplined world of martial arts, respect isn't just a tradition, it's sacred. So when Steven Seagal, a rising Hollywood name in the late 80s and early 90s, arrogantly dismissed legends like Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris as inauthentic, he didn't just stir controversy, he lit a fuse. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. Seagal, fresh off his early box office hits, began boasting about his superiority over the very icons who paved the path he now strutted down. He claimed American martial artists lacked real training, that Bruce Lee's techniques were theatrics, that Chuck Norris, in all his celebrated discipline, wasn't the real deal, and in one sweeping act of ego, he disrespected the very foundation of the community he had just entered. The martial arts world didn't stay quiet. It answered. What followed was the formation of the Dirty Dozen, a group of legendary fighters, including Bob Wall, Benny Urquidez, and Bill Superfoot Wallace. These weren't just names, they were battle-tested warriors, many of whom had trained under or fought alongside Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris. They challenged Seagal openly, demanding he prove his words in combat. It wasn't about violence, it was about honor. And as the tension grew, all eyes turned to Chuck. He didn't lash out, he didn't grandstand. But his silence was telling. When Chuck Norris stands beside men like Bob Wall and supports their challenge, it sends a message louder than any insult. He had made his position clear. Disrespect wouldn't go unanswered. Seagal, predictably, refused to fight. He backtracked, dismissed the controversy as exaggerated, and avoided any real confrontation. But the damage had already been done. The media feasted on the feud, framing it as a showdown between old-school honor and new-age arrogance. Norris, the quiet storm, stood for discipline, humility, and tradition. Seagal, the flashy outsider, represented ego and bravado. In interviews, Chuck didn't attack Seagal directly. He didn't need to. His support of the martial arts community, his acknowledgement of Bruce Lee's enduring legacy, and his rejection of Seagal's arrogance spoke volumes. He chose the high road, but everyone knew which side he was on. For Seagal, the refusal to engage cost him more than credibility. It fractured his standing in the martial arts world permanently. While he continued making films, he never earned the respect of the legends he had insulted. He became a cautionary tale proof that no amount of fame could erase a lack of honor. For Chuck, the incident solidified what many already believed, that he wasn't just a fighter, he was a guardian of the martial arts legacy. He had taken hits in silence before. But when a peer crossed the line, Chuck made it clear where he stood. While martial arts feuds were intense, ideological clashes proved even more divisive. Opposing worldviews and public satire turned colleagues into adversaries. Hollywood has never been just about films. It's a battlefield of ideas, values, and belief systems, and few rivalries have embodied that clash more than Chuck Norris and Alec Baldwin. What started as two respected actors on different paths quietly evolved into a symbolic war between two Americas. On one side, Norris, the principled conservative, a man who believed deeply in faith, tradition, and personal responsibility. On the other, Baldwin, the outspoken liberal, wielding satire and ridicule to challenge everything Chuck stood for. The tension wasn't born from a film set, or a shared project. It was born from ideology. And once the lines were drawn, there was no going back. Chuck Norris had always stood firm in his beliefs. He wasn't just a martial artist or an actor. He was a patriot with a platform. He used that platform to support Republican candidates, speak out on cultural issues, and defend values he saw as under attack. His columns, speeches, and public endorsements painted a clear picture. Norris wasn't interested in staying neutral. He believed the country was drifting away from its foundation, and he wasn't afraid to call it out, even if it meant alienating people in his own industry. That alone created friction in Hollywood. But the real flashpoint came when Alec Baldwin began mocking Donald Trump on Saturday Night Live. Baldwin's portrayal, though comedic to some, felt like mockery to others, especially to conservatives, like Chuck, who saw it not as humor, but as deliberate disrespect. In a blog post published during the height of Baldwin's SNL run, Chuck lashed out not by name, but in meaning. He accused Hollywood elites of belittling American values and creating division through their so-called comedy. He warned of the dangers of normalizing contempt for leadership and morality. It wasn't difficult for readers and media outlets to connect the dots. Baldwin was the face of those elites, and Chuck had just fired a silent, devastating shot. The response was immediate. Commentators jumped in, fans took sides, and what was once unspoken became undeniable. Baldwin and Norris were now cultural adversaries. Baldwin never publicly acknowledged Chuck's remarks. He didn't have to. His performances became louder, more provocative, almost as if fueled by the backlash. Meanwhile, Chuck doubled down on his message. He wasn't afraid to stand alone, to risk the ridicule. To him, this wasn't a petty feud. It was a war for the soul of a country. And if that meant clashing with colleagues, so be it. Their conflict transcended Hollywood. It reflected a nation divided, two men, two worldviews, two Americas fighting for dominance in the same spotlight. Generational differences would further strain Norris's relationships in Hollywood. Traditional discipline meets modern unpredictability. In a volatile encounter, Chuck Norris had spent a lifetime building his reputation on control, order, and unwavering professionalism. So when he crossed paths with Shia LaBeouf, an actor whose brilliance was often eclipsed by his volatility, the clash wasn't just inevitable, it was explosive. They were brought together on a commercial project, a routine collaboration that should have been forgettable. But it wasn't. Almost from the beginning, something felt off. Norris, a man who arrived early, knew his lines, and treated everyone on set with the same level of respect. Watched as LaBeouf brought with him an entirely different energy. Restless, chaotic, often dismissive of direction. What might have passed as eccentricity in some circles felt, to Chuck, like a violation of everything he stood for. There were no public outbursts, no headlines, but behind the scenes, the tension was unmistakable. Norris didn't confront LaBeouf directly, but those close to the production recalled how visibly disappointed he seemed by the actor's behavior, improvising without permission, showing up late, and treating the crew as if they were lucky to be in his presence. And then came the post. A short, cryptic message on Chuck's Facebook page. Fame without discipline is chaos. No name was mentioned, no incident described, but fans and media alike immediately connected the dots. It was the kind of quiet strike only a seasoned warrior could deliver, sharp, calculated, and deliberate. By that point, Shia's reputation was already splintered. Legal troubles, tabloid scandals, outbursts captured on video. His immense talent often took a back seat to his unpredictability. To many in the industry, he was an enigma. But to Chuck, he was a symptom. A symbol of everything that had changed. In Hollywood, the erosion of respect, the glorification of rebellion, and the disappearance of the work ethic that had once defined the craft. Norris wasn't condemning the man. He was condemning the movement. A new generation of performers who treated discipline like a burden instead of a virtue. For Chuck, it was more than a personality clash. It was an ethical standoff. He had come from a world where you earned your place through effort, humility, and commitment. Watching those values dissolve in front of his eyes wasn't just frustrating, it was heartbreaking. This wasn't about one bad experience. It was about watching the rules of the game change while the older players stood powerless to stop it. The feud with LaBeouf never exploded into headlines, but it lingered like a quiet scar. A reminder that Chuck Norris, no matter how revered, was now a relic in a world rushing to redefine itself. One generation prized legacy, the other, attention. And in that gap, respect was the first casualty. These personal and professional conflicts paint a complex portrait of a man navigating a changing industry. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.